7 of the 10 most deprived areas of England witnessed riots in the past 2 weeks. The Prime Minister's polling ratings have plummeted since the outbreak of the riots in the UK, according to Telegraph polls. And Sir Keir Starmer has been criticised for his response, including the decision not to hold a Cobra meeting until a week after the outbreak. But how does the government go about tackling the root causes of the disorder? Well, joining me now is academic and author Matt Goodwin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Matt, you've been writing about this on your Substack. You're very much involved. You understand what's going on here. Help us through it, because a lot of people are really confused. Why has all this happened?
Well, I think, firstly, there's an element of criminality and disorder that we've all seen on the television screens. But I think behind that, ultimately, are widespread public concerns over mass immigration, over a broken model of multiculturalism that we might come back to talk about, and also, just to be blunt, the feeling among many British people that they're no longer safe in their own country. Now, I've received a lot of criticism for pointing this out over the last week, but one of the points I make is in response to both the riots in 2011 in England and also in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, everybody out there was more than happy to say, look, there are wider grievances here, there are some underlying issues we need to talk about. But now in 2024, we're seemingly not really allowed to discuss those issues, and I'm trying to get those issues onto the table so we can have an honest conversation.
Is that a partisan issue politically, insofar as a lot of the people causing violence on the Black Lives Matter protests were far left, and we have had some far-right elements to these riots? I mean, there are people who have been arrested multiple times over many years.
Yeah.
Looks very much like they're just piggybacking on this for a bit of thuggery, right? There's an element of it.
There's definitely an element of criminality, but I would have personally liked to have seen Keir Starmer come out and say, I condemn violence on all sides. But behind that, as we've even seen in the polling, we have somewhere between 40 and 60% of British people also saying, look, I don't want anything to do with this violence, but when it comes to the peaceful protesters, I either have sympathy for them, I think peaceful protest is justifiable, or I even openly support what these people are doing, because I think everybody can sense that what this is really about, it is about our broken borders, it is about the policy of mass migration, it is about multiculturalism and segregation. And many people have said to me, look, what you're doing is you're taking the Southport issue and you're trying to turn it into something else. I think, actually, no, if you look at the average person in this country, it wasn't just about Southport, it was about what happened to those police officers in Manchester, it was about the stabbing of the British Army officer, it was about the machete gangs in Southend-on-Sea. People don't just look at one incident and say, I'm now only going to focus on that. What I think this is about is a general sense of concern about the breakdown of our country and what is contributing to that. And Keir Starmer and Labour have so far shown no real interest in discussing those underlying issues.
It's part of the problem that we are seeing this in terms of left and right, whereas actually a lot of the problems with mass migration happened under the Tories. And perhaps this is the wrong way to look at it. A lot of the riots, I'd say most of the riots, are happening in Labour strongholds.
Well, I think ultimately this is about public opposition to an elite consensus in this country that we've had for 30 years. I don't think it's a left or right issue. I think many people are utterly frustrated with both the Conservatives and the Labour Party and how they failed to address these issues. So tell us about that. What's
this elite consensus? I know you talk about this in your book.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain what you mean by this?
I think we're in the midst of a political and cultural revolution in this country, which is basically organised around mass migration, the erosion of our national borders, the imposition of radical progressivism or woke ideology, and a broken model of multiculturalism that basically prioritises differences among groups rather than what draws them together. And all of that has found its expression through these disturbances. We've seen how segregated our communities really are. We've seen minority communities not waving the Union Jack, but shouting, Allah Akbar as an example, or waving Palestinian flags. That's a pretty good sign that they're not really prioritising their British identity or their English identity, but we've got sectarianism in our country. We know the borders are broken. We know that many people are saying, well, why have we got 130,000 people in the country illegally? Why can't we seem to control who comes in and out of the country? And this has become really a lightning rod for this opposition to that elite consensus. And many people are saying, look, if I can't express my voice in now on social media, or I can't express my voice in the national conversation, I think actually many people have looked at things like Black Lives Matter, or they've looked at protests on other issues, and they've said, well, look, those guys are getting things done by marching and protesting in the streets. Maybe we should do that as well. And it's difficult for us to have this conversation, right? But that, I think, is what many people in the working class have concluded. No one's listening to me about grooming and the scandals in northern towns like Rotherham. Why was
Yes.
the rioting so severe in Rotherham? I would argue because that's where the most severe case of sexual exploitation and grooming was
Yes.
in Rotherham. And I think that's where people are feeling as though they don't have a voice in this conversation. So they're now, unfortunately, however, sometimes incoherently, they're taking to the streets to try and express that.
Now, of course, the word racism is thrown around an awful lot, and maybe it comes down to a misunderstanding of multiculturalism. And I would argue that the very philosophy of multiculturalism, that various groups should live in parallel societies, sealed off, that's a kind of form of soft racism. But is it just to do with a misunderstanding of what multiculturalism means?
Yeah, well, I think we have this rather ridiculous debate among columnists and elites in this country, which is multiculturalism is a success story. How dare you question it? It's very visible to anybody who lives outside the M25 that it's not really working. What multiculturalism, the policy of multiculturalism does is it prioritises minority groups, their history, their identity, their culture and their values. It says you can keep all of those things, you can stay distinctive from the wider national community, but at the same time it says to the majority group, you cannot really defend and celebrate your identity, your history and your values. And if anything, what we want you to do is reshape those things around universal liberal values like diversity and multiculturalism. So lots of British people and English people are saying, well, hang on, how come these groups are allowed to prioritise who they are and celebrate it and defend it, but we're now being told that we have to reshape our entire identity around these universal liberal themes? Because, look, Andrew, to say that a country is welcoming of diversity is fine, right? Whatever. But it's actually not the basis of an identity, because it's like saying you have no identity of your own. If the only thing that really unites you is that you're welcoming difference, well, OK. But it's also like saying there's nothing unique about you. And many British and English people feel there is something really unique about being British and English. It's not a race thing. It's just we've got a remarkable set of values. We've got a great culture. We've got a great history. But we're told time and time again that we should be ashamed of that. We should be embarrassed about that.
OK, well, final question. What can Keir Starmer actually do? Isn't he in quite a difficult position? The Labour Party are saying that they're trying to resolve all of this issue. But is it clear to you that they are failing, or are they trying their best?
I think this has been a complete failure for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. We've seen in the newspapers this weekend that they've admitted they're frightened and they're scared to talk about the underlying causes because they're worried that will be seen to be justifying the unrest and the disturbances. So, what they've done instead is they've had this bizarre conversation about social media and clamping down on free speech and free expression, which you've been talking about with other guests. But unless we actually get into this much more meaningful conversation about how are we going to control our borders, what do we need to do? We need to leave the ECHR and reform the Human Rights Act. How are we going to end the policy of mass immigration? Nobody really wants it. Nobody really voted for it. It's dividing and weakening our country. And how are we going to replace this broken policy of multiculturalism with a more assertive assimilationist model that says to people, look, we're not going to tolerate people who hate who we are anymore. We're going to change our country. We're going to give us a sense of confidence, a sense of hope in the future. We're not going to allow this disorder and chaos to continue. We need to get into that conversation. Keir Starmer will not get into that conversation, which means I think inevitably we're going to have a lot of people looking for a different kind of politics going forward.
Matt Goodwin, thanks very much for joining me. Really appreciate it.